I want to have you hold that up there.
You're going to have to hold up there.
Are you at the,
Right at the top.
are you near the top of the wall on that beam?
I'm right on it.
Huh?
I'm right on it. It's level right here. You got it? Good. How long do you want me to hold this?
Okay. Well, that's not working too well.
The other thing I want to know about is the Nelson that was in Marymount. Yeah.
I wonder, maybe we will be told tools of the trade.
In Pennsylvania, and my father over here, ABM Covalt, has now brought all of us, 10 children and our parents, out to this area, and it's pretty hard going, but we're sticking with it. So I will start our regular meeting now. If you haven't paid your dues for 2003, and a lot of you have, this is a good time to do that. Bill Holloway is here, and he'd be glad to take care of that for you while you're here. I think you probably all noticed in the tracker that we are on the web now. How many of you have had a chance to look at our site? Not too many, but a few. A few people are on the computer. That's good. If you're not on the computer yourself and you know, don't look at the internet, get somebody else to show you, because we do have what I think is, thanks to Greg McMillan, really, I think we do have a wonderful website. Besides the Historical Society on there, we have links to the building survey that the Women's Club did and to the Terrace Park site. We also have, thanks to Greg, a place called Terrace Park on there again. He's saying that he probably will sometime fairly soon be able to put the pictures on. You know, the pictures have never been in there with it, and of course the book is out of print. And then I've put in there the Village Views articles that I've written, just because they have historical background in there that you might like to look at. And for people that don't get the Village Views, that's a place where you can look at them. So do have a look at that. It's www.tphistoricalsociety, all one word, .org. Over here at the side table, we have things to buy. Besides the note cards, we also have David McNeil's book on the Kroger line, and there's a new book now. It's pictures of Cincinnati. The copy that we have over here now that Julie's showing is a copy that belongs to Louise Holly. She's the one that brought this to me, and it's available for $19.99. It has wonderful pictures of Cincinnati in it. It is out of print at the moment. I mean, in other words, it's been printed once. They're going to print it again soon. So if you would like a copy, sign up, and we will order copies. And I think they will be in within a month or so. So it's not a long-term thing. They will be printed, and we can get them. So that's something else to buy. And all those things the Historical Society does make a bit of a profit on. So that's another way for us to gain some money. The Heritage Home Tour, although unfortunately I wasn't here, evidently was a great success. Unfortunately, I cannot tell you at this time what money we're going to have earned from it, because although the Garden Club board has met and come up with a figure, the general membership has not yet voted. So we're going to have to wait a few more days to find that out. But I think we will be pleased with what money we're getting. I hope people enjoyed participating in it. From talking to Garden Club board people, they really did appreciate what we were able to put into it. Not only the historical backgrounds, which we really did, but it gave them a bigger pool of people to be hosts and hostesses in the homes, and a bigger pool of people to be selling tickets. So they really did appreciate our efforts. So I hope they'll ask us again. It's not really in our power to say whether we want to do it. I guess you all know there's a problem in this building. The floor is better at the moment since it's been painted, but there have been already some meetings on the topic of the problems with this whole community house complex, which would include this community house itself, which of course was built as a Baptist church. It's the same era as 3 buildings still on the street, the furthest one up house and 2 houses across here. And it also includes, of course, the other buildings where the fire, EMS, and police are. I went to a meeting that was on last Thursday evening, and I was very pleased with the general attitude of the people there. It wasn't anything where this is what I want and I'm going to get it. I don't care what you're going to get. It was a general attitude of, well, these are the needs of this group, these are the needs of this group. I think we can work it out together so that we can get something that everybody will be pleased with. Everybody's not going to get all of what they want, and it's probably not going to work that way, but we'll get as close to it as we can. Now, a question was asked to me by Jim Roth, who isn't able to be here this afternoon, at that meeting, and I thought I'd just ask you. We did have you all indicate whether you were strongly in support of, kind of in general, Save the Community House, and it was unanimous that the Historical Society is in favor of saving the community house. But now there's also kind of a question of what specifically do we mean by that? Do we have to have every single thing still here that's here, or do we mean that we might be satisfied, if we can't have the whole thing, to have at least the facade? Now, I don't mean building something that looks like the facade. I mean having the actual mortar that's out there, because it is a cement structure. As you know, it's a quarry building, built by the builder Washington Corey, George Washington Corey. So I'm going to ask you the same question that I was asked the other day, and it was prefaced by saying, I don't think this is really fair, but I'm going to ask you this question. Now, here's the question. So I was asked, what Jim Roth wanted to know was, in general, do you feel strongly that you must have the whole thing as it is, or do you feel that you must have at least the facade or maybe the front part of the building? How many people must have the whole building? How many people feel strongly? And I'm not going to write down. So quite a few of you feel quite strongly that you must have the whole building. How many feel that they must have something of it, but perhaps something that's easier to take care of than this building would do for part of it? How many feel that way about it? Yeah, so we've got some in each camp, and I'm not going to write down who you are, so don't worry about that. There is going to be a follow-up meeting tomorrow night, that's Monday, at 7:30 here. Having had the discussions at Thursday night's meeting, there were some considerations that were brought forward that the architects, I think, hadn't been told about, and so the meeting's going to be continued tomorrow night. I have canceled or I have changed, I'll put it that way. I've changed the Historical Society's board meeting. We're not going to have a board meeting at my house tomorrow night. The board is to come here at 7:30 for that meeting because we feel it's important for us to have input on what's going to happen here. So I would encourage any or all of the rest of you also to come, because I think that we kind of need to put up a united front as to somehow this building has to be saved, or at least important parts of this must be saved. I don't even want to entertain a plan which calls for take the whole thing down. I know there's some people that feel that way, but I'm not interested in take the whole thing down and build something new. So I think we need support that you've shown on keeping the building at least in some form. So that's 7:30 tomorrow night. I think those were all the things that I needed to cover. And so I'd like to introduce Stan Brown, who today is my father, Abraham Covalt. He's the one who's brought us out here, and he's going to go on with the rest of the program. Oh, no, I did forget one thing. This is important. This was left at the party, which I guess was a very successful party too, at the Rockaways. Whose is it? Anybody claim it who's here? Well, I don't know what else to do with it. So. Okay, Dad.
Welcome to Bethany Town. We've got a good fortification going here. We need more people in order to make it go. But one thing I've noticed, not a one of you men brought your rifle today. You know, that's the rule. If you're coming to a group meeting, you bring your rifle. We're fortunate, however, that the 1st American Regiment from down in Fort Washington has sent some men out. We've got some of them out watching that the doggone savages don't steal our horses. And we've got Ken Berry from Fort Washington. If I slip out just a moment, Ken does this thing, and he would love to talk to you later about somebody who may want to become a member of the 1st American Regiment and some of the other things he does. He's a guy I work with when I do some volunteering at the museum downtown. But to get back to the good stuff here, Ken, we'll let you in a minute tell what you do. If any of you folks want to buy some of the land that we have, that'd be fine. A couple hundred years from now, we may find there'd be a meeting like this, and you'd sign up and go to a thing and get a free dinner, and if you consider listening to buying a piece of land. Remember, 214 years ago seems like a long time. In history, it really is a short time. We've got people here who have had so much fun reading Stockades in the Wilderness, and it was my good fortune to meet Dick Scamyhorn 2 or 3 years ago when he said, yes, I'll come and talk to your class in the ILR, Institute for Learning and Retirement. He did, and we've become good friends since. He's got so much knowledge that it's just fun to be around and soak some of it up. So, Ken, would you tell us a little bit about the 1st American Regiment, because you're out here protecting us for today in case the savages come around.
Indeed I will, sir. My pleasure. I am Private Barry of Captain Hart's company of the 1st American Regiment. Today I am acting corporal of the detachment sent up here from Fort Washington to help protect you fine folks at your meeting. And as Mr. Covalt here has pointed out, it is a standing rule that all menfolk are to go about armed at all times, as there may be an emergency. I'd hate to see any of you fine folks out there standing before the magistrate. As I mentioned before, I am the acting corporal. Our sergeant, who would normally be in charge of the detachment, has unfortunately been released due to some bad conduct out in the town, and our regular corporal, he indeed has come down with a case of the fits of distemper. So has fallen to me to be in charge of this detachment, which is the reason why I get to stand in here indoors while the rest of the soldiers are out in a skirmish line, making sure the heathens don't come through to attack us and take our scalps. As I mentioned before, I'm acting corporal. Falls to me because I have spent some time as a non-commissioned officer, both with the 1st American Regiment and with the 8th of Pennsylvania during my service under General Washington in the Continental Army. As a matter of fact, I even made it once all the way up to sergeant. I was senior sergeant for a time being, but only briefly, as my constant wrestling with Demon Rum seems to always get me in front of my commanding officer. Now, the 1st American Regiment did come out this way back around 1785 originally with Fort Finney, which was built over towards the far western border of what's now Hamilton County. Fort Finney was flooded out shortly after a very important treaty was signed there. Later on, around 1788, Major Doughty comes out. He's the the officer in charge of the artillery and the engineering for the 1st American Regiment. Comes out and lays the foundation for Fort Washington, which is considered to be the finest wooden fortification of its kind in all of North America in 1790 when the construction is finished. Fort Washington is well supplied with artillery and with several hundred troops there, federal troops, and winds up being the capital of the Northwest Territory. Governor Sinclair coming down and moving his offices into the fort itself. Later, Governor Sinclair receives his commission as a general. Of course, he was a general during the late war against the British, and leads several hundred troops and militiamen against the Indians, well, what's known as Sinclair's defeat, most unfortunately, to one of our worst defeats known in history, to the United States Army. Of course, this is a couple of years in the future. Later on, the 1st American Regiment is sort of rolled into what becomes the Legion of the United States under General Anthony Wayne. At that point in time, in 1794, General Wayne is able to lead our glorious troops to victory against the heathen savages at the Battle of Fallen Timbers. So there you have a short encapsulation of the history of my glorious regiment and my time period. And after the programming, if anyone would like to speak with me further about my adventures and other activities during the Revolution or thereafter, I'd be more than happy to talk to any of them. Thank you.
There's so much in history, it's so much fun. I brought a whole bunch of things that would have been used and you should have brought if we were coming down here on a flatboat so that you could use them afterwards. We'll talk about that later, and some of you want to know how come that deer skin had a hole in it. Well, that buckskin had a hole in it because that was the way it was brought down. My good friend Dick hasn't been feeling well for some time. He's agreed to meet with us here, some of us in Terrace Park, and just have fun for about 4.5, 5 hours just talking history. If some of you don't like the kind of history we have, slip quietly out, because a lot of us want to just keep going as long as Dick's got something to share with us. Dick Scamyhorn has written a book called Stockades in the Wilderness with a guy named Steinle. They're not together. One's out there and one's here. But I understand he's working on some more stuff. So if you've got good things later that you might want to feed to him for a future publication, but by all means. Dick Scamyhorn, former fireman in Cincinnati. Actually, just one. I don't have the whole story, but Dick at one time when he was with the Cincinnati Fire Department was putting out a fire on the 3rd floor, and all of a sudden found himself on the 1st floor. It did slow down his job with the fire department for some time. Dick Scamyhorn.
Thank you. First of all, I want to tell you that it's really, really a pleasure to see the interest here in Terrace Park. I didn't think I'd ever see that, really, when I was working here. So, and secondly, I want you to understand we know how to improvise here in Covalt Station. We know how to do it. I hope that doesn't fall over. Well, first of all, some of you I know have heard me talk before, and, yeah, and I recognized a couple of people who walked out, but that's all right. But, I am going to overview some things, and so I hope I don't bore those people who have heard it before, because I think it's important. First of all, Covalt Station is one of the most important historical sites in Ohio, and definitely in the Little Miami River Valley. And it really needs to be recognized. People have forgotten all about these old stations. And we've destroyed just about everything here that you could destroy. And aside from the historic aspects, Covalt Station was sitting in an area that was just filled with some of the most humongous earthworks, prehistoric sites in America. Everybody came here to work. Peabody Museum took a lot of things out of this valley. And that's unfortunate. And your site here, had a great earthwork on it at Camden. So, but they're all gone, and there might be a little vestige here and there that wasn't plowed or destroyed by development, but I can tell you this is a very, very important place. And the people that came down here had two ways to get here. And initially, they could come over what was called the Wilderness Trace. And remember, they were coming from New England as far as Maine. And they were coming down either overland or by water. Now, to begin with, most of them, although it was arduous, they went overland because most of them were settling in Kentucky. This area was not open for settlement on the north side of the Ohio River until 1787, when an ordinance was passed. However, there were numerous squatters in here between the Little and Great Miami River. Excuse me. And also on the Scioto River and north of that. There was probably 1,500 up on the Scioto River at one time. They were so entrenched there, they defied the government to try to put them out. And some of those people actually got their land later. And they took what they call squatters' rights. I mean, it was occupied. And of course, the surveying and everything else was quite different than it is today. And when John Cleve Sims was selling this land by parcels, he really did do a very good job of keeping track of everything. So he was selling land that didn't even belong to him up by Dayton, Ohio, as we know it today. And those people had to buy that land again. So, but that having been said, when they did open up in the territory and they started down here, a lot of them took what they call the Wilderness Road, which came down through Virginia, Pennsylvania, Virginia, West Virginia today, and into Kentucky, because that's where they were settling, Kentucky or on down. And maybe some of them went to Louisville and on beyond that, into North Carolina. And when they first started, you couldn't drive a wagon through here at all. So you had two ways to go. And I'll demonstrate that here in how they did it. But you were packing your things in here on horses or walking. And then when the wagon roads were finally opened up, they were very crude. But then they started bringing their wagons in here. And anyone coming from the east would have to stop at a place called Wheatyville, Virginia now. And it was called Fort Chiswell at that time. And they had to leave their wagons and buy pack horses. So it was a trade-off for them. And another place was down at, I'm sorry. I have some here, thank you. But what they did was they would trade their wagons off and then got the pack horses and went on from there. And they tried to move in like caravans for safety. The Indians were really hitting them hard down here in Kentucky. Then when they finally, started coming in here by river, and by 1790, 40% of people were coming down the river from Pittsburgh. There's a place called Redstone Old Fort, right above Pittsburgh. and they were coming from Wheeling, and they called it Limestone, but now they call it Maysville. But when you came down by boat, you were really taking a risk, because that's where they really caught you and killed you fast, and they would kill everybody on those boats or take them. So, let's just get into this here a little bit. See real quick. First one, when they started, am I blocking anybody? Let me, just tell me, you know, I've been hit before. Now here's the primary transportation over the Wilderness Trail. It's called Mule Shank. I know this is inconvenient for you. Is that better?
We're gonna have trouble hearing that.
Well, that's interesting.
Okay.
Well, improvising. Can you see everybody? Tell me if you can't see. Okay. How's that? Look better? So this is the primary way they came in here, overland. Then they used the pack horses. And if you notice, they've got those pack horses tied off, and they would even roll their bedding up on each side of that pack horse, lengthwise across the back, and they would tuck their children in there. The small children were riding those. Or they mounted a basket on the side to carry them. Now, 2 men, one in the front, took the lead. You notice the horses all tied off. And there'd be one in the back. And 2 men could actually, they can take care of 15 to 20 of the horses closed off. And here's the way, an example of what it would look like going through the woods. And they would put their scouts out on each side to flank and try to watch for the Indians ahead of them. You can see that she's got all of her utilities right there, everything they own. Now, these people here were smart because they brought a Knox in here with them. And most people came in here brought horses. And that was the worst mistake they could make, to bring a workforce in here. But that's what they were used to in Pennsylvania this place. But that's the first thing the Indians want to do is steal your horse. I mean, they were to steal your horse and kill you, really. I mean, if they could get that horse and get out of there, they did. So, the people that did bring these oxen here, they were renting them out a lot. Now here's like 2 typical vehicles that would be used. This is called a shay over here on the right, and the other one is just a farm wagon. Now, so many of them traveled in what they call Conestoga wagons. They were built especially for that. And if you ever see the Conestoga wagon, it comes up on ends, and that was because it kept everything in place when they were going up and down. This would be a typical type of Conner wagon. See how the sides are not like a farm wagon straight across? They bowed in there, and they were very heavy. And that kept all your things inside in place. Or it helped once you turned it over. And here's another view of it. That's a smaller one. And then when they started coming down the river and using the flatboats, which was the primary boat that was used, that was a one-way trip for you. Flatboats were built economically, most people could afford those, but they were not built to go back up the river. And what happened was they had to either tear your boat apart and use it for building materials, or you had to just sink it or just let it drift. Now, at one time there was a rule at Maysville that you had to sink your boat if you were going to leave it. They didn't want the Indians to get a hold of it. So, I know that General Harmer at Fort Washington and other people had bought boats. They went up there and bought those boats at the Maysville River and had them come down the river, and they used those to help build Fort Washington and a lot of other places. But in Washington, Kentucky, you'll see at least one house that was built partly out of wood. Thanks. And this would be a typical flatboat. Your family came, the animals came, And people that could afford 2 boats they put their stock in another boat, but they always tied off a canoe so they could go ashore to hunt, whatever, for whatever reason they needed to go ashore, that's what they used. But now see, some of these were covered, if you can see that's open in the front, open in the back. These people in the back are steering that, and look how long that oar is, that rudder. But some of them were covered all the way, some of them just were covered on one end. And you paid for these boats by the linear foot. And then they got you when they sold you the extras, your pump, and everything else that went with it. So, but the basic boat was fairly cheap for the flat boat. And they got a little more expensive when you got into what they call keel boats. And there's another typical flat boat. See the difference in that, the way the top is on that? Now see, everything else is stored down below. Now some of these boats would actually have fireplaces inside there. And it's everything, I mean, they're cooking everything in there.
How long would
Now
the
see,
trip
here's the
take?
difference.
This is from Pittsburgh to Cincinnati?
Yes, correct.
How long would the trip take?
Oh, well, that's a good question, and that could vary from about 2 weeks to 2 years. And the reason I'm saying that is this. That's an exaggeration, but here's what these people had to depend on when they started using the Ohio River. In the summer, during drought seasons, you were stranded. You could not come down this river because it had a mean draft about 1.5 foot in places. The Ohio River.
Really?
So, if they tried that, even if they got off, let's say at Pittsburgh, somewhere along the line, they were going to go ground. That was it. And you see, they couldn't afford to hit a lot of gravel or hard sand because it'd take the bottom out of the boat. And it did on many of them. The best time for them to travel was in the fall or in the spring, you know, and in the winter. And it was risky in the winter, but a lot of them did it because the ice was packed up in there, and that would cave their boat in too. But it was miserable traveling in the winter. But sometimes they were forced to do that. Even General Wayne, when he had his army ready to come down to Cincinnati in 1793, he had to wait there for a long time. He would have been there before that, but he couldn't get down the river. And that happened with a lot of military people.
And
Now
are the dams the reason that the water is higher now?
Oh yes, of course. The dams were put in to raise the pool, because river transportation was the way everything was going to go until railroads come in. And so that's when they started what they call low-level dams. And then now, of course, we have the dams that you have today, which is much deeper. But in the beginning, that's why, before there was ever a dam, that's why that river was called the Beautiful River. Because when the French and so forth, all those people saw that river the first time, and they included the Allegheny River as part of the Ohio River. You got 2 rivers forming, Monongahela and the Allegheny, but the Allegheny was the prettiest. It was quick, and it was stony, and it was clear water. It was beautiful. And then when they got down here, if you can imagine, the Ohio River was in places very narrow, for one thing, and the trees were growing right down in the water. So, I mean, it was completely different than what you see today. And if you were to fly over the river by air, you see what a serpentine river that really is. So if you say, well, what took them so long? Just the distance is different than it would be. See, because today, even, you could take a boat and go straight lines. They had to follow that channel all the time. They had to. And there were a lot of islands. Now here's your another type of flatboat, and up here you have on the extreme left, on the extreme left, upper left, it's what's called a prow, and it's a dugout canoe. And those were used a lot here in the lower part of the Ohio River. We didn't see a lot of birch bark canoes down here. They were used a lot on the lakes and those places. Once in a while you would see it, but not often. That dugout was used a lot. And they would usually use a soft wood to make them, and they would build a fire on and then add them out. That's the way they made them. And then you'll see 2 of them mounted with a top on top. A little cabin over it. And sometimes mills were built like that. They would have stones mounted between them, and they would grind corn in there. Now this was an improvement. This is a keel boat. You go up and down the river, had sails. It had these pole men, and if you notice, they're leaning on those poles. And they actually started up here. You see the man on the left coming around? What he's doing, he made his trip, now he's coming around for another one, and when they finished that, their one trip, they had to reverse and come back, because they were always pushing that down. Now, if it got real, if you got in a real muddy part of the river, you know, you were kind of stuck. Then they had to get out and do what they call cordeo, and they would actually get on the bank even, with a long line, and pull that boat. I mean, you know, it's just unbelievable. And because there was very few times that you really use a sail upriver here. I mean, you could do it at times, but that was unusual. But these were very popular, a little more draft on these boats, and they were more expensive. But they were in the vogue at one time, if you could afford them. And here's how one of the ways they dispose their watercraft. Because they did, at one time they had to do that at Maysville. That was an order for them to do that. Of course, like I say, if the Army or someone knew that and they could buy those boats at 50 cents per dollar, I mean, you know, they had them, you know. And a lot of people built their houses, they just tore them apart when we got there. Later on, a lot of these flat boats were actually floated down to Mississippi, and they were sold, and then the lumber was shipped to places like St. Louis. Somebody was really, an entrepreneur there, really made some money.
What was the initial cost of the boat?
It depended on, it was by the linear foot. And a flat boat could run you $1 to $1.25 a foot. Plus, like I say, yeah. Now here's, we'll get down here because these are the things you're going to be interested in here, the log structures. And here's kind of a basic way they initially put up a log cabin. Now, if you had the manpower, if you went out there, you know, just all group, these were family affairs. In other words, everybody joined in to build each other's cabins. And they got drunk. I mean, you had a barrel of whiskey there. That was after they got it up. But that was typical. It was just like today when you go over to help, and you know, they'll have the wife will cook something for people that are helping you. Well, that's okay. Well, if you notice, they would usually have what they call 4 to 6 corner men. And they were the people that really knew, they did the notching and everything else like that, and setting those corners and making sure everything was right. And that was a very important job. Now, while these fellows are doing that, you see how they're rolling. Now, this is a round log construction, which was what most of the early cabins here would have been, not these huge cabins like you see today. That was later. And when they would do, while they were rolling that up there was somebody else had already been out, and they picked, one man was in charge of picking the size and the trees, in other words. He picked out the trees he thought would be the best. Then they went out there and cut those, and a lot of those were dropped before they ever started this project. Because sometimes they could put this much together on one day. You know, and they were simple affairs, and that's why today, if you were an archaeologist, you couldn't really find what they call post mold in the ground, because there was no posting here. In other words, you put your steels and so forth down, and your sills, and they were set on stone to level them a lot of times, and that was about it. And a lot of them didn't have a floor in them; they were dirt floors. Now the chimneys were put on 2 different ways. Some of them were built inside, and some of them outside. And at the beginning, a lot of them were stick and mud, so to speak, stick and clay. And the problem with those is that the Indians could pull those apart and get in. Because once you got inside, once you got that off there, you know, that's a big open. They used big fireplaces. There was a little cabin I worked on up in Brown County, and there was a woman still living in it. The first time I saw it was about 1970, and interviewed her in there, and it had been her family. She was going to have to move. That had been occupied since it was built. 1802, and I was just blew me away, that cabin, because originally she said they had all the background, and they had a humongous fireplace which had been covered up a little bit, But she said they would bring the oxen, would drag this log in there, and then it was dirt floor, and then they roll it right into the fireplace. And they took the oxen out the other end. And that cabin I saw it was just about falling apart. That was a shame. But the thing that really did amaze me was, now they had a brick chimney. I'm sorry, a stone chimney. The fellow did a wonderful job when he was laying it up until he got right to the peak of the roof, right at the crown of the roof. And I don't know whether he was into the barrel or not, but that chimney started going this way. And it stood there, but it stood there all those years. And I was hysterical when I saw that. You know, it was so funny. You see, and here, that gives you a good idea. It was just a lot of manpower, so it was, you know. It is a special tool. Now if you study your history, read history, you'll hear the term half-face cabin. Well, this could be considered a half-face cabin. This was a more elaborate one, but it's a hunter's cabin. But that's typically what it is. And the idea is this: you just put your wall up, and you're living inside, and you're actually getting your heat and everything from this firelight in front, and you're doing your cooking out there. Now, believe it or not, when John Cleese Sims brought his party down here, he was a doofus in a lot of ways, because he'd come down. He had a chance to get down here earlier with Stipes in the summer, but he procrastinated and waited until it was dead winter when he came down. Now, he had the idea in his mind that he was going to stay down at Fort Finney with his people until they built their own cabin, which is what this gentleman talked about, Fort Finney. That's right at the mouth of the Great Miami. Well, the problem was it was flooded, and the fort was inundated when they got there. So they lived that winter in half-face cabins like this. And here's now if you notice the shingles up here on the roof, see how they're cut, they're elongated and everything. They would just split those logs with a froe, and some of the tools are laying around here. And very crude. If you saw a real shingled roof, which was a little more refined, it would usually take the heartwood and use that. But it was probably a German construction, because Germans are always neat. You know, we Germans are neat. But this one here is very crude, but it did the job. That's all I care about. And there's all different types of ways of finishing the roofs and the style in your cabin, everything you do in your cabin, really. Oh, there is a point I want to make. Most people, if you notice the tree stumps around here cut, you know, most people try to clear space around their cabin so that the Indians could get right up on them. They would see them coming. They gave them a chance to get in the cabin. And here is one that it's out of wood, you see on the outside. And now this is a little more elaborate on the roof here. You see these poles, they're holding down the shingles, so to speak, as before. But then these are put in as spacers, and down here is a pole that holds that whole thing in place. And these roofs, a lot of these roofs were made so they could kick that roof off there, because they didn't want to get trapped in that cabin. If the Indians were really going to do a number on it, they would light the cabin up a lot of times. Then the people could just push that out and then get out the top. Because a lot of times you may only have one door and a window on each side for cross ventilation. Now here's one. Now this is an actual cabin which it's from Georgia, and but you see it's basically the same type of thing. And what I like about the illustration here was on the chimney. Now, then you had civilian defenses. They weren't just primarily cabins to live in. They had to what's called fortify. Here's one from Pennsylvania, and they would call this a blockhouse. When they were fortified, they were called blockhouse. If you notice upstairs, that little hole, the little opening in the right hand, well, that was for rifles to shoot from. They could roll around that building. Now here's one that's set right on the wilderness trail. And look above the door and window, and you see the fire port up there? They get in there where they're not too exposed. And that cabin was actually sitting on the wilderness trail. Now this cabin is sitting down at Gratz Park in Lexington, and it belonged to Robert Patterson. And of course, Robert Patterson was one of the founders of Cincinnati and Dayton, Ohio. And he was quite a man. But he built that as a block house in Lexington, and it was finally moved over here to Gratz Park. But it's all, they haven't changed anything on it. You notice all these little holes here? And you notice one on the left, second one up. A lot of times they would use those if you had your horses outside and you didn't corral for it. Well, you didn't like to let the horse get too far away from the cabin to start with. And if you had room, you'd room in. I mean, people, that's how desperate they were. These Indians would, I mean, you could steal a horse in a blink. And they would actually put a chain out there on that horse, on the hole, so that if he was being disturbed, they could throw that chain out. And then, if they had dogs out, the first thing they did was to turn their dogs loose. Oh man, they tear them up, you know. And they trained those dogs, you know. They were bad news for Indians. But you see, now you get a little better. See, there was one on that side too. But that was actually what would have been considered. I would consider it a fortified cabin. They call it a blockhouse. But now here was the first blockhouse built in Lexington, 1779. There was a sketch made of it, and that's it. And you notice they got the little pickets surrounding. Now, people that put individual blockhouses up to themselves, or cabins, fortified cabins, that's the kind of situation they would be in. They would picket just close by. And sometimes the pickets were more or less to keep the cattle and so forth in and protect those Indians. They weren't as tall as the ones you would see like at Fort Washington and some other place like that. Now this was going to be the first blockhouse at Columbia, and you'll notice it's just ringing this off. You get up toward the gable here. Now this blockhouse set down near the Miami River, and it's in House Historical Collection of Ohio. He sketched it. And for years, you see, they called it a blockhouse near the not Miami, but he used to call it like a sugar camp, you know. And well, the problem with that was that he had that. I knew what the distance was from the fort to this cabin, and by a statement was made by General Harrison's son-in-law. And so I started mapping that, and it comes right down to Fort Simmons. So my conclusion was that this was one of the outbuildings that they built at the treaty site in 1785. And it would stand up pretty good. Now this is a little station, a typical, this station, I know Terry is in the stations over there, and at first we thought Nelson's had one station there. There was 2 sons and a father. But after more research, I found out they had 2 of them. But this was one that was sketched in 1808, and it was over in the school district over in Nashville. But you notice it's just and what that is basically, it's what they call a double pin or dog trot cabin house. You see there's what they call pins, it's say a cabin on this side and a cabin on that side, and they're joined by a common roof. And some of those were open breezeways in the middle, but then you could also close them up, close them up all together and make apartments out of that so some other member of the family. And this was a huge station in Kentucky. And if you notice, the station was set close to some water, and the inside is perfectly clear. Now, normally, the safest way to build these roofs on these cabins was to slant the roof one way. It would be more like a salt roof, slanted to the inside. which made it very difficult if they were one story for the Indians to get up on them. If they were slammed the other way, which was the case at that station, when they built that, they slammed them all out. The dog wouldn't even jump on them. But these are just a little different. They're gable, but they're fairly tall, and because you can tell that by all the pickets around it. And they've got 2 gates on there, and that would be a typical type of fortification or station, stockade. Because most of them were picking these up out of Kentucky construction, while she came up to Kentucky. Now here's another one, and they have the gable roofs also. And when they did this illustration, they even got the names listed for the people who were living in those cabins. Now these cabins were built before they were sell them over here whatsoever. And if you look, they're atypical, you know. Now here, on this side, this cabin, you know, they do have some of them planted in that way. And I'll show you one that's built just the way it really should have been. Now see, there's one that's built, that's on, it's on Kitchen Station. Now, see how those roofs are pointing out the wrong way? But they did that so the water wouldn't run in. They didn't want that water running down there. But most of the people that knew how to construct it, they would dig a ditch in there and then drain it right out of it. As long as they didn't get into their stockade wall and undermine that, they were fine. Now, if we're going to talk about Covalts here, I think we should go into some of the plats here and how this evolved here. And this was not called Montauk or Camden or Territory or anything else. That's what it was called, the town of Ziegler.
Oh, what?
Town of Ziegler. And this is actually a plat of that. And two men, a family, actually bought from Covalt at one time, or I shouldn't say bought from them, by then San Juan Highway had that, but they were the ones that ran the first mill here after the Covalt mill was done. They were running a small mill. So they platted this. Now, then they added on to it. And it becomes very important to a researcher because as they added on here, and you keep reading the surveyor's notes on these things, how it's described, it becomes important here in locating Covalt Station. Here's the drawing I made of this with that extension on there. And you may not be able to read that. What it says is original plat subdivision by Thomas Rue, agent for Christian. And the original was 7/26/1817. Now, in 1841, a combination company had that ascended, which included Nicholas Longworth and Brewster, and they had bought this out, and they got some of it out of the court case. But then, after that, it was not known. It was vacated after that. But if you notice, I have this, where that line came up, this Cobalt Run, and then it came up the Lane Reedy's back line. And Lane Reedy's probably a very important thing when you're aligning things with Cobalt Station. And here it is after this was the vacation of it. And here was one of the original plans of Camden. And I think it's upside down. So is that. And, well, that's gravel lot. And that was one of the original plats of a gravel lot. It was subdivision gravel lot, really. Well, we can get that done. We can't do that. Yes. Oh, that's laid plans. Got one stuck in there. Maybe you get it good now.
Speak up a little bit.
Now yeah. This is an early part of Terrace Park, or Montauk. And here we have gravel lot, which is a subdivision, but it gives you an exact location when you get these official records like this. And of course, like I said, this is Camden, and it's but you can see everything on here, and a lot of these street names have changed. That's what I know. And that was, oh mercy. Give me a break.
Just go ahead.
Well, here's an aerial they took of Terrace Park. Medford. You see the bridge up here. I took these in 85, I think, 80. Here's where East Fork comes in. But these areas are all important because they're historically that's where a lot of people were crossing, they had their ford, but people were killed down here. I don't know if you recognize these, does it? There it is. Now this was just drawing a Covalt station. I know a lot of people have, I think of a square station, like Worthington. But if you'll notice, Cornelius Sedan, who was the officer of station here at that time, in Fort Washington, 1791, they even made a petition to General Farmer for protection. And at that time, she was calling it Bethany Town or Covalt Station. And if you notice, it's definitely rectangular. And all these lines out here show a line, in other words, the porthole there where the fire will be showing the line of fire where you couldn't get near that station without being hit from any angle. And that's what those lines represent. Now, the bad part about that is that what you didn't put any cabins for, so there's so many ways to set this up, and I just made here's three, my own opinion, the way they could have been. On the left-hand side, you have cabins within the stockade wall. In other words, the stockade goes completely around. And then the cabins are set, parallel there with the walls, set inside. And if you notice on each end, there's a rectangular picket, and that was for their cattle. And he specified that, that's what it says. Now, in the second one here, the middle one, you got individual cabins with pickets forming the stockade wall, which is what you saw in some of the slides before, in Kentucky. And that's the way that would have been. Now, the only difference is, let me go this one first. Now these would be called abutted cabins forming the stockade wall completely. Now they can do that, and in that case those would have been either what they call saddlebag cabins or dog type of cabins. but it would have been totally enclosed that way. Now, what you have to think about after it's enclosed, how do you get out of there? Well, the gates were marked on there, but they definitely would have had to have a gate on each end for the cabin. And what I think what will happen here when you finally solve this problem is getting the true alignment of that stockade, because for one thing, came in here, I don't think that was the case. I think they were depending on the water, like out of the Little Miami River and Covalt from over on. So that's something that just has to be worked out. And I wanted to, before I close, I want to give you something interesting, couple of interesting things here. When you're researching, you get information the funniest ways. And there was a gentleman, and this man's from Brooklyn, New York, wrote me a letter 3 years ago. And he said he wanted some information on an ancestor he thought was up Covalt Station. But he didn't have much on him. But he felt he was here, and his name was Hutchins. And boy, I love that. I said, of course he was here. This man, Gabriel Hutchins, actually married Hinkle's wife after he was killed. And that is super stuff for your history here. And here it is, all documented thing. So that's the kind of thing, and you come by it in the strangest ways sometimes. But people have their Bibles, their family Bibles and so forth, and they finally open up and let you have them. Say, it's just like when Abraham Covalt Jr. was murdered when they were out hunting. Now, history says that the tomahawk and so forth were dropped and all this business, you know, but what happened was his tomahawk fell out of his belt when he was running after he was shot. And that tomahawk was actually found 30 years later. And they positively identified it because it was wrought by a blacksmith here and had double edges on it, hand wrought. So they were positive about that. And his gun and so forth didn't turn up. But when Covalt Sr. was killed, now this is testimony by a contemporary source, but still you don't know if they were getting that firsthand or not. And when Covalt Sr. was killed with Hinkle, they said he was wearing some silver cufflinks, buttons they call it, and they said when in 1795, after the peace treaty was signed, an Indian came up here to Covalt Station and asked for one of the young guys there if he was a Covalt. He said, yes. He says, well, I killed your father. And he showed him the buttons and the Covalt Sr.'s gun. And the people were irate because this Covalt, whichever one it was, he let him go. So they were really mad. But there's certain strange things happen, you know, and the more contemporary information you get, the better history you're going to write. But I just thought this part was just absolutely the greatest, you know. And in one of the problems here in identifying this, the exact location is because of all the landform changes here over so many years. And when the Roos came in here early, they went ahead and started building another mill race and so forth, so they made some changes. But here's one here, I want you to read it, because Lane Reedy, here's Lane Reedy again, his property backing up here. And it said, this was 1840. It says, Lane Reedy and married to Robert Shoemaker, Lars Anderson, Longworth, and so forth, for $1, the right to alter or change the course of a mill run, which is Covalt Mill Run, with improvements by the Rue family, so called from its natural bed or course, and the right to overflow or flood so much of the farm of land of Lane Reedy and Mary by the water of said mill, and so forth. And he even gives the lot numbers that were overflowed here, and you know, they correspond with what was laid out here by Rue earlier. See, if you got to take that, all those plats from the Ziegler Town and so forth and start backing these up, well, then you get a better idea what we're talking about. Because everybody agrees that it was Lane Reedy's property. The thing was, the other people that bought this were not here, like the Andersons and Longworth and that corporation, they were here for quite a while, and they really made a big development here. Instead of having one island out here, you had two, because of all the mill races and everything, the way they industrialized that. And then the Armstrongs were even up here later. So there's so many changes, let alone the buildings that have gone up here, you know, the residents. And unfortunately, so many folks came in here, they weren't interested, they didn't know anything about this. Now, there was a genealogist that came down here, I forget where she was from now, but she wrote me after she was here and said, well, she says, I think the burial ground's across the road over Booster Pike. I said, well, yeah, there is a burial ground over here. I said, but that's not their burial ground. I said, because it was right here on their property, and it states by the witnesses that I've seen and reported was that it was just below the mill itself and just below the station, very close to it, but it would have been out on the bank of Miami Avenue, and it was on a little knoll, rising knoll, and that's where the cemetery was. So, see, a lot of that, by erosion and everything else, a lot of that stuff would be gone.
Dick had mentioned, somebody said they were building a house across from St. Thomas many years ago that they did find some bones. That may have been the cemetery we're talking about. It's actually up on the hill, not way down in there.
Oh yeah, this was on a rise. It was like kind of on a knoll. But the way it was expressed in this testimony was on a rising knoll that juts out into the river. You know, does that jut out in the river?
No, but the river has changed considerably.
Well, here's another thing. There were a lot of people killed here. And some of them they buried right out in the cornfields here. They buried them right there. And Clements was one of them. They're from Roundbottom. He was shot out there and he severed an artery, and he died before he could get him in from loss of blood. And
Who was with Abraham Sr. when he was killed? Clement?
Yeah. Oh no. He was with Hinkle, the millwright. Covalt and Hinkle were probably on the side of the hill up here by Worcester, and they were cutting timber up there, and there was a work crew below clearing and planting, and they were going to build another cabin out. And people were starting to build. Surprisingly, Columbia is a good example of that. Stites was the first one in here. They come down and they land over to Miami. And right away, I mean, they were prepared. I mean, they were cutting shingles and everything else up in Maysville. They come in here and bingo, they got a blockhouse up the first day. I mean, and then they just kept building. But for some reason, you know, there weren't too many people. There were two boys, the Seward boys were killed in '89 here. But these people started building away from there. They were even although Columbia was down to the mouth of Crawfish, which would be Delphi Avenue now, that was Stites' western limit, and Little Miami being the other. And there were people living right down there by Crawfish. Spencer and a lot of the other, they all had cabins. And it was amazing that they would get that far away from that fort. And there was another community, if you want to call it that, was called Morristown, right up on, and you know where you come around the hill, what they called Undercliff, going out Eastern Avenue there. And,
Undercliff?
You would be going now toward the Beachmont Levee and all that, but you'd make that big curve. Well, they were built up on that hillside then. And, you know, I mean, you're out in the boondocks there. Well, I mean,
You know, where did, when Abraham Senior got killed and they moved, did they go to Columbia or to Girard Station?
Well-
I understand there are some,
Well, here, there's a lot of
Guards,
conflicting
yeah.
reports about that one. And I have to say this, really be careful about accepting everything Mary Covalt said. And that's what she gave, I wasn't, and don't, and you better believe it. But that was many years afterwards, and that's the problem you have when you start looking at all these testimonies. They're contemporary in a way, but still, if the more material you gather, the more confusing it gets sometimes, because you say, oh, he's got this date.
My mind's been gone
but-
about it, right?
But, as to the events, you have to go back into some of these documents that where you've got testimony by people that were here. And Levi Buckingham, was with Covalt. And a man called General John Webb was a youngster, but at the time his father was there. They came down here with Covalt in the same boat, or well, partially. But they were in a flotilla when they left, and they came down in the winter. And I want to tell you, those dates are firm. 1789 winter, 1789-90. Don't anybody tell you they aren't either. Because they made 2 trips down here and back. And that's what gets confusing. And
So what you're saying is 1789 is the date?
he came up here and looked at the property, and what he did, he started that winter, he started some, 89, he started some cabins, but the thing wasn't stockaded completely in until the spring of 1790.
And there's also information about 88, so.
No, Mary, that's wrong, Mary. I had that student knock me off for that. I mean,
I'm correcting something that we have.
no.
He said there's a correction in there that puts it to 88, it would be put at 82.
Yeah, I told you that story about that young lady getting me, but good. And she said, I don't care what you say. She said it was 88. Mary said it was 88.
Could you say a word about the Roundbottom station at the other end of Terrace Park?
Did they say anything about it?
when you talk about Ferguson Clements,
Yeah, that's Roundbottom. Yeah.
well, a lot of these people would not be familiar with Roundbottom Station.
Oh, I see, I'm sorry. That was, they called it either Clements or Roundbottom Station. And actually, some of these people were here at Cobalt, and that becomes confusing again. People were coming in and out of this station here, and they would stay here for a short time, and they did that at Columbia. There was so much intercourse between all these people, it was hard to keep track of them. And they were marrying back into the same family, so I mean, it was just, I'll give you a little example that you probably enjoy this. It's a little incident that happened here. And let me see if I have it here. Let me give you a little incident that happened here. And I got this in Indiana, and then in Indianapolis, out of some manuscripts there. And it was Judge Gopher's notebook when he was holding trials here. And it said, Cobalt Station, court entry, April 6, 1791. Now, at that time, as they told you, you had to carry your gun with you all the time to church or whatever, but they had very strict laws about how, where, and when you could fire that gun. Because, you could set all the people off in a panic, in a hurry. Well, here's what some nitwits were doing. And you'll recognize some of these names. Here's the court. Judge William Gopher presiding. Court versus Ichabod Benton Miller and others. Charged violation of an ordinance passed August 4, 1790, forbidding indiscriminate firearm discharge at certain hours and places. Charged with Miller were William Spears, William Moore, Reason Bailey, and Charles Bruce, who all but Spears were firing at targets within 60 foot of the gate. Now, Charles Bruce was, he actually formed his own station over toward Hamilton later. Luke Foster was a lieutenant in the local militia under Captain John Mallow. And he was on duty at the time on the Friday in question. Foster testified that Miller, can you all hear me? I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Okay. Foster testified that Miller was there with Spears, William Moore, and the other defendants were target practicing. Luke Foster warned them to stop firing, but Miller prompted them to continue and disregard Foster's warnings. Charles Bruce, later the founder of Bruce's Station, the court found him guilty, and Reason Bailey and William Moore were fined $1 each, plus court costs for firing. Charles Bruce was fined $2 in court costs, and he begged the court 20 days to pay the fine. Ichabod Benton Miller was fined $2 in court costs for inciting. So I mean, they were serious about this.
Dick, we've got a zillion more questions, but I think we better try something else at this. This book here is not available to buy unless you get on the eBay or something you might find. However, it is at a variety of libraries, and it's in the History Library downtown at the terminal. So if you want to find out more about some of the work he's done, and you realize that his work is not finished, he's still collecting. And if there are people who have relatives or think they have relatives, and this guy has dug out stuff that I'm not patient enough to do. I go in the library down there in about a half hour, it's about all I can handle. But you read this, and you read about one, you read about this stockade, you read about this one, you read about Girard, you read about Mercer. This is called Stockades in the Wilderness.
Very good book.
What's that?
It's a very, very good book.
Yes, it's a fun book, and I keep reading through it, and then I realize how closely all these things are tied and how many of them there were in the area. And when I think about the work this guy did, you can go back and check, check Article 5 of Claremont Sun and all those things, but I don't have the time to do it. However, some of you have a place called Terrace Park, and if you do, you'll see that Dick is quoted in there on more than one occasion. And there is a pretty neat chapter in here about just the stuff we were talking about today. So this, you can't get the pictures apparently, but it is on Terrace.
TPHistoricalsociety.org, and right there on the left-hand side, it will say, on the home page, it will say, I think, a place called Terrace Park, and you just click on it, and you'll come up with the whole text from here. And it also divided into chapters, so you can find it quite easily.
So it's pretty neat stuff. And the one thing I like is about young Mr. Hinkle, who was 15 when his father was killed. He went down to Beasley, down Plainville, and he met a girl and married, and came out here after their wedding. They danced on the ice in the Little Miami River. They came out here, didn't have any blankets or anything. They slept in their clothes and so forth. He had a pot with a broken leg, and they didn't have anything to eat with until he made something out of wood. And it's only a bait, but it's neat stuff. And this guy is responsible for digging out those kinds of things. And I think some of you, after we have a cookie or two or whatever, or something to drink, I would like to ask Dick some other questions. And so let's break up this part of it now, and I'd invite you to look at these things and see what they're all about, and give Dick.
No, I'm sorry, I'm failing here.
Well, I say he's been telling me for weeks that his health is not what it's supposed to be, and he agreed to